Jake Murphy had exactly 3 rules for space hauling. First, always get paid up front. Second, never ask what's in the cargo. Third, never, ever, under any circumstances, pick up hitchhikers, especially the kind that sent distress signals from the middle of nowhere. So naturally, here he was, drifting toward a smoking wreck of an escape pod, like the galaxy's biggest sucker. "This is Jake Murphy aboard the Rusty Bucket responding to your distress call," he radioed, already regretting every life choice that led to this moment. "You folks having a bad day or just testing my patience?" The response came through as static and what sounded like dying whale noises. Jake's universal translator kicked in with all the enthusiasm of a government employee on Friday afternoon. "Please help, my child." Jake's stomach dropped. Of course it was a kid. The universe had a sick sense of humor. He found the pod's occupant barely clinging to life. She was Ziltharin, judging by the blue-tinged skin and those massive eyes that somehow looked both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. What really caught his attention, though, was the tiny bundle clutched in her arms. "Listen, lady," Jake said, kneeling beside her, "I'm not exactly the nurturing type. My last houseplant died from sheer neglect." The Ziltharin woman, who Jake would later learn was named Vera, grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "The Dominion, they destroyed our ship, killed everyone, but they cannot have my child." Jake's blood ran cold. The Dominion didn't just kill people. They collected them, studied them, did things that made hardened space pirates wake up screaming. "They're coming," Vera whispered, her grip tightening. "Promise me, promise you'll keep him safe." Jake looked down at the bundle. 2 enormous eyes stared back at him, and he felt something in his chest crack like a hull breach. The kid couldn't have been more than a few months old in human terms, but those eyes held an intelligence that made Jake's skin crawl in the best possible way. "I don't know the first thing about babies," Jake protested weakly. "Neither did I," Vera smiled, and Jake realized she was fading fast. "But love is universal." She pressed the child into Jake's arms, and he nearly dropped the kid in surprise. The little guy was warm and surprisingly solid, and when he looked up at Jake with those huge eyes, something fundamental shifted in Jake's worldview. "His name is Kip," Vera whispered. Tell him his mother loved him more than all the stars." And then she was gone, leaving Jake alone with a baby that was probably worth more than his ship, his cargo, and his life combined. "Well, Kip," Jake said, looking down at the now quiet child, "I hope you like terrible food and inappropriate language, because we're about to have the worst adventure of our lives." That's when his proximity alarm started screaming, and Jake realized the Dominion had found them. Jake had faced down pirates, navigated asteroid fields, and once talked his way out of a customs inspection while carrying a hold full of contraband liquor. None of that had prepared him for the sound of an alien baby crying at maximum volume while Dominion fighters closed in. "Okay, Kip, I need you to work with me here," Jake said, awkwardly bouncing the screaming child while trying to plot a hyperspace jump. "I know you're scared, but so am I, and at least I'm not filling my pants right now." The proximity alarms were going crazy, which meant the Dominion ships were close enough to see what brand of deodorant Jake wasn't wearing. He'd managed to strap Kip into a makeshift carrier fashioned from cargo netting and prayer, but the kid was having none of it. "This is Commander Throck of the Dominion's 7th Fleet." A voice boomed over the comm. "Surrender the Ziltharin spawn immediately, and your death will be swift." Jake keyed the comm. Counteroffer. "How about you go stick your head in a black hole, and I'll consider not making rude gestures at your mother ship." The response was immediate and violent. Plasma bolts lit up space around the Rusty Bucket, like the galaxy's angriest fireworks show. Jake threw the ship into a spiral that would have made a carnival ride jealous, and miracle of miracles, Kip stopped crying. Apparently the kid liked aerobatics. Who knew? "That's my boy," Jake grinned, pulling the ship through a loop that stressed the hull plating. We're going to get along just fine." The celebration was short-lived. One of the plasma bolts had clipped his starboard engine, and Jake could smell something burning that definitely wasn't supposed to be on fire. His hyperspace drive was fritzing, life support was running on backup power, and Kip had discovered that his new favorite activity was grabbing at the control panel. "No, no, no," Jake said, gently moving tiny hands away from the self-destruct button. "That's not a toy. That's how we all become space dust." Commander Throck wasn't giving up. Jake could see him on the scanner, methodically closing the distance with the kind of patience that suggested he'd done this before. A lot. The Dominion commander was built like a walking tank, but with gray skin that looked like it had been carved from asteroid rock and eyes that glowed with the warm friendliness of dying stars. He'd been hunting Ziltharan refugees for years, and Jake had just painted the biggest target on his back since someone invented the phrase "kick me" sign. Jake's ship shuddered as another plasma bolt found its mark. This time, the hit knocked out his artificial gravity, and suddenly he was floating through the cockpit with a baby who thought weightlessness was the best game ever invented. "Having fun, are we?" Jake muttered, catching Kip before he could float into a bulkhead. "Let's see how much you like it when we're both frozen corpses drifting through space." The engine sputtered and died. Jake's stomach dropped as he realized they were running on emergency power and prayer. The nearest inhabited system was 3 days away at sublight speed, and he had maybe 6 hours of life support left. Time to get creative. Jake strapped Kip back into his carrier and started pulling panels off the walls. The rusty bucket wasn't pretty, but she was tough, and Jake had spent years jury-rigging her systems in ways that would make engineers weep. "Watch and learn, kiddo," Jake said, as he started cross-wiring the coffee maker to the hyperdrive motivator. "This is either going to be brilliant or spectacularly stupid." The hyperdrive whined to life, sounding like a dying cat with a head cold. Jake didn't care. It was working, and that was all that mattered. "See you in hell, Throck," Jake said, and hit the jump button just as the Dominion ships closed to firing range. The stars stretched into lines, and they were gone. Jake's hyperspace jump landed them in the Kepler drift, a collection of asteroids, abandoned mining stations, and the kind of people who asked questions like "want to buy a kidney." The rusty bucket limped into docking bay 12 of Nix's Emporium, which was fancy talk for slightly organized junkyard with a bar. Nix Corin was waiting for them, all forearms crossed and his reptilian face wearing the expression of someone who'd just stepped in something unpleasant. "Jake Murphy," Nix said in his gravelly voice, "you look like 10 pounds of trouble in a 5-pound bag." "Always nice to see you too, Nix," Jake replied, carefully extracting Kip from his carrier. The baby had slept through the entire hyperspace jump, which Jake decided to take as a good sign. "I need supplies, repairs, and maybe a very large drink." Nix's golden eyes went wide when he saw Kip. "Is that what I think it is?" "Depends." "What do you think it is?" "A death sentence with tiny hands and a tendency to drool." Jake couldn't argue with that assessment. "The kid's parents are dead. Dominion killed them. I promised I'd keep him safe." Nix made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a death rattle. "Jake, you magnificent idiot, do you have any idea who that child is?" "Should I?" "My. That's Prince Kip of the Ziltharan Royal House. His bloodline goes back 3,000 years, and his psychic abilities could reshape the balance of power in this sector." Nix moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The Dominion's been hunting his family for years. They want to use him as a weapon." Jake looked down at Kip, who was currently trying to eat his own foot. "This little guy? He can barely coordinate his own limbs." "Give him time," Nix said. "Ziltharan children don't manifest their full abilities until they're older, but when they do," he shook his head. "Let's just say the Dominion would rather see him dead than free." The conversation was interrupted by alarms. Not the gentle, polite alarms that suggested maybe you should pay attention to something. These were the screaming, hair-on-fire alarms that meant everyone was about to die horribly. "Dominion ships incoming fast," Nick said, checking his scanners. "Looks like they tracked you here." Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. How many? 12 fighters and a heavy cruiser. And Jake? That's Commander Throck's ship. The first plasma bolts hit the station's shields, and Jake knew they were in serious trouble. Nix's Emporium wasn't exactly a fortress, and Throck had enough firepower to turn the entire asteroid field into glowing debris. "Get to your ship," Nick said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "I'll buy you time." "Nix, no, this isn't your fight." The old trader smiled, showing teeth that had seen too many battles. "Kid, I've been in this business for 40 years. I've smuggled weapons to rebels, information to spies, and hope to the hopeless. But I've never had the chance to save a prince." He handed Jake a data chip. "Safe passage codes to Zilthara. Get him home." Jake wanted to argue, but Kip chose that moment to start crying again, and the sound cut through him like a plasma blade. The kid was scared, and it was Jake's job to fix that. "Thanks, Nix," Jake said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. "Don't thank me yet," Nix replied, already moving toward the station's weapon controls. "Just don't let that kid forget that a cranky old lizard thought he was worth dying for." Jake ran for his ship, Kip clutched against his chest. Behind him he could hear Nix's guns opening up, the sound of defiance in the face of impossible odds. The Rusty Bucket's engines were still warm. Jake strapped Kip in and fired up the launch sequence, his hands moving with the kind of desperate efficiency that only came from years of running from trouble. As they cleared the docking bay, Jake saw Nix's station light up like a star. The old trader had overloaded his reactor, taking half of Throck's fighter squadron with him in a blast that would have made supernovas jealous. "He bought us time, kiddo," Jake whispered to Kip. "Let's not waste it." 3 days into their run to Zilthara, Jake discovered that alien babies had the same superpower as human ones, the ability to turn a grown man into a sleep-deprived zombie. Kip had developed a schedule that seemed designed specifically to maximize Jake's suffering. Sleep for 20 minutes, cry for an hour, repeat until insanity. "I'm starting to think your mom had a sense of humor," Jake muttered, changing what he desperately hoped was the last dirty diaper in the ship's supplies. "Stick the human with the crying baby. That'll teach him to be helpful." The really disturbing part was that Jake was getting good at it. He'd figured out the difference between Kip's hungry cry, his scared cry, and his, "I'm going to scream until your ears bleed just because I can cry." He'd even managed to jury-rig a bottle that worked with Ziltharan baby formula, though he was pretty sure it violated several health codes. That's when Kip decided to demonstrate why the Dominion wanted him so badly. Jake was trying to plot their next jump when every piece of electronic equipment on the ship suddenly started talking to him. Not the normal kind of talking, the kind where displays showed information and computers beeped helpfully. This was actual voices, speaking in languages Jake didn't recognize, all saying the same thing over and over. "Mama. Mama. Mama." Jake spun around to find Kip sitting in his carrier, those huge eyes glowing with soft blue light. The kid wasn't crying. He wasn't even making noise. But somehow every circuit in the ship was echoing his thoughts. "Well," Jake said, as his coffee maker started reciting what sounded like Ziltharan poetry, "that's not terrifying at all." The psychic episode lasted about 30 seconds, but it was enough to fry half of Jake's navigation systems and apparently broadcast their location to every Dominion ship in the sector. Jake's proximity alarm started screaming again, and this time it wasn't just Commander Throck. It was an entire fleet. "Okay, Kip," Jake said. As dozens of ships appeared on his scanner, "I need you to keep the glowing eyes thing to a minimum. We're trying to be sneaky here." The baby gurgled happily, apparently unaware that he'd just signed their death warrant. Jake pushed the rusty bucket harder than he'd ever pushed her before. The old ship groaned and complained, but she held together, carrying them through the kind of space battle that would make war correspondents weep with joy. Plasma bolts turned space into a light show, and Jake found himself flying through explosions that would have vaporized smaller ships. Commander Throck's voice crackled over the comm, and Jake could hear the frustration in every word. "You cannot run forever, human. Surrender the child, and I will make your death quick." "Counteroffer," Jake replied, pulling the ship through a barrel roll that stressed the hull plating. "How about I feed you to a black hole, and you can debate philosophy with the event horizon?" Throck's response was to launch every fighter he had. Jake's ship shuddered as plasma bolts found their mark. His shields were failing, his engines were overheating, and his life support was running on backup power. Again. At this rate, he was going to die of carbon dioxide poisoning before the Dominion could shoot him. That's when Kip saved their lives. The baby started crying again, but this time his psychic abilities kicked in at exactly the right moment. Every Dominion ship within a light year suddenly had their targeting computers start playing what sounded like lullabies. Their weapons systems began firing in random directions, and their navigation computers started plotting courses to the nearest ice cream vendor. "I take it back," Jake said, as chaos erupted around them. "Keep doing that glowing thing. I like the glowing thing." Jake used the confusion to punch through the Dominion lines, but he knew it wouldn't last. Throck was too experienced to be stopped by a baby's tantrum, and Jake's ship was falling apart around him. The hull breach came without warning. One moment Jake was congratulating himself on their narrow escape, the next he was watching atmosphere vent into space through a hole the size of his fist. Emergency systems kicked in, sealing the breach with emergency foam, but the damage was done. Life support was failing, engines were offline, and they were still 2 days from Zilthara. Jake looked down at Kip, who had fallen asleep despite the chaos. The kid trusted him completely, and Jake was about to let him down in the most spectacular way possible. "Sorry, kiddo," Jake whispered. "I tried." That's when he remembered Nix's parting gift, the data chip with safe passage codes. Jake had been too busy running for his life to examine it closely, but now he plugged it into his damaged navigation system and held his breath. The codes weren't just for safe passage. They were for a hidden Ziltharan defense network, a collection of automated stations that had been protecting refugee ships for years. "Nix, you beautiful, sneaky lizard," Jake breathed, as friendly ships appeared on his scanner. Jake's crash landing on Zilthara was less heroic arrival and more controlled falling with style. The rusty bucket hit the surface of the planet like a meteor with commitment issues, carving a furrow through crystal forests and scaring the local wildlife into therapy. When the dust settled, Jake found himself hanging upside down in his pilot's seat, held in place by straps that had seen better decades. Kip, meanwhile, was gurgling happily in his carrier, apparently convinced that crashing into planets was the best game ever invented. "Note to self," Jake muttered, unbuckling himself and immediately falling on his head. "Next time, bring a ship with working landing gear." The rusty bucket was done. Her engines were slag, her hull was more holes than metal, and her life support was making sounds that suggested it was planning to quit without notice. But she'd gotten them here, and that was all that mattered. Jake gathered Kip and what supplies he could carry, then stumbled out into the alien landscape. Zilthar was beautiful in the way that made postcards jealous, crystal spires reaching toward purple skies, forests that sang in harmonies that hurt to hear, and cities that looked like they'd been grown rather than built. It was also crawling with Dominion troops. Commander Throck had arrived first, Jake realized, as he watched drop ships disgorging soldiers across the planet's surface. The Dominion commander wasn't taking any chances. If he couldn't capture Kip, he'd burn the entire planet to make sure no one else could have him. "Well, Kip," Jake said, as plasma bolts started falling like rain, "this is where things get interesting." Jake found cover in the ruins of what had once been a Ziltharan temple. The building was ancient, its walls covered in carvings that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. Kip seemed fascinated by the place, his eyes glowing with that soft blue light. That's when the Ziltharan refugees found them. They emerged from hidden passages like ghosts, their blue-tinged skin pale with exhaustion and fear. There were maybe 50 of them, the last survivors of their royal court, and they looked at Kip with expressions that mixed hope and desperation. "Prince Kip," one of them whispered, an elderly female with silver hair and eyes like deep water. "We feared." "He's alive," Jake said, gently transferring the baby to her arms. "His mother made me promise to keep him safe." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I am Counselor Ava, last of the Royal Council. We have waited, hoped, but the Dominion has taken everything." Jake looked around at the frightened faces, the children hiding behind their parents, the warriors who'd run out of things to fight for. "Then it's time to take it back." Commander Throck's voice boomed across the landscape, amplified by speakers mounted on his war machines. "Surrender the child, and I will spare your pathetic lives. Resist, and I will turn this world into a monument to your failure." "Born mom. Warren Wyman's one." Jake keyed his communicator. "Throck, this is Jake Murphy. You want the kid? Come and take him." The response was immediate. Dominion forces converged on the temple like a tide of death and bad intentions. But Jake had exactly 17 bullets, a jury-rigged plasma rifle, and a collection of improvised explosives that would either save them all or turn them into the galaxy's most spectacular fireworks display. "Everyone stay down," Jake said, as the first wave of soldiers reached the temple walls. "This is about to get stupid." The battle was chaos. Jake had positioned his improvised bombs around the temple's perimeter, and when the Dominion troops breached the walls, he turned the ancient building into a maze of explosions and falling debris. His plasma rifle overheated after the first dozen shots, but he'd expected that. The real weapon was the temple itself. Kip was glowing again, his psychic abilities reaching out to touch the ancient stones. The temple began to sing, its walls resonating with harmonies that made Jake's teeth ache. The Dominion soldiers stumbled, their weapons misfiring, their communications systems filling with static. "That's it," Jake encouraged the baby. "Show them what you can do." The temple's song grew louder, and Jake realized that Kip wasn't just affecting the building. He was connecting with something deeper, something that had been sleeping in the planet's core. The crystal forests began to glow, their light pulsing in rhythm with the baby's heartbeat. Commander Throck appeared in the temple's main chamber, his massive form silhouetted against the burning sky. He was carrying enough firepower to level a city block, and his eyes held the kind of hatred that could melt steel. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience, human," Throck said, his voice like grinding stone. "I will enjoy watching you die." Jake stepped between the Dominion commander and the refugees, his empty hand steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Yeah, well, I never did like making things easy." That's when Kip's abilities finally reached their full potential, and Jake learned what it meant to witness the birth of a god. The light that erupted from Prince Kip didn't just illuminate the temple, it rewrote the fundamental laws of physics in the immediate area. Jake watched in awe as the baby's psychic abilities reached out to touch every living thing on the planet, connecting minds across species barriers and reminding everyone present that they were all part of something larger. Commander Throck froze mid-stride, his weapon lowering as his eyes went wide with what Jake could only describe as sudden, overwhelming understanding. The Dominion soldiers stopped firing, their faces slack with wonder as Kip's telepathic abilities showed them exactly what they'd been trying to destroy. He's showing us who we are," Throck whispered, his voice filled with something that might have been tears. "All of us. Connected. The same." Jake felt it too, a warmth that spread through his chest like the galaxy's best whiskey, a sense of belonging that he'd never experienced in his entire cynical, sarcastic life. For just a moment he understood what Vera had meant about love being universal. Then Kip stopped glowing, yawned, and promptly fell asleep. "Well," Jake said into the sudden silence, "that was intense." The Dominion forces withdrew without another shot fired. Throck himself lingered for a moment, looking at the sleeping baby with something approaching reverence, before turning and walking away. Jake had the feeling that the commander would be doing some serious thinking about his life choices. The Ziltharan survivors emerged from hiding, their faces filled with hope for the first time in years. They had their prince back, and more importantly, they had a future. Kip would grow up to be the leader they needed, the one who could unite not just their people, but potentially the entire sector. "You did it," Counselor Ava said, approaching Jake with tears streaming down her face. "You brought him home." Jake looked down at the sleeping baby, then at the faces around him. "I just gave him a ride. He did all the heavy lifting." They offered him everything: money, ships, titles, a place in their royal court. Jake turned it all down. He'd done what he'd promised Vera he would do, and that was enough. "Besides," he said as he prepared to leave, "I'm not really the settling down type. Too much galaxy out there to see." As Jake walked away from the crystal cities of Zilthara, he carried with him the memory of a dying mother's last request and the knowledge that sometimes the most important cargo wasn't what you were paid to carry, it was what you chose to protect. He'd find another ship, take on new jobs, probably get into more trouble than any reasonable person should survive. But he'd also carry with him the understanding that in a galaxy full of darkness, sometimes all it took was one person willing to risk everything to keep a little light alive. Somewhere behind him, Prince Kip was waking up to a world full of possibilities, surrounded by people who loved him more than all the stars. His mother's sacrifice had meaning, his people had hope, and the galaxy was a little bit brighter because one cynical cargo hauler had decided to do the right thing. Jake Murphy had been the worst babysitter in the galaxy, but he'd also been exactly what Kip needed. Someone who understood that love wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up when it mattered most. And as Jake disappeared into the starfield, looking for his next adventure, he couldn't help but smile. After all, someone had to keep the galaxy interesting, and it might as well be him.